Okay, so we have a question here from someone who is using the malaria vaccine introduction costing tool in Kenya. Our person says, I'm working through the Kenya analysis with the country team. I have a few questions on service delivery. The first question is, in the outputs, do we include the number of vaccines administered? In this case, for the outreach, you had 60 and 50 as output for doses 1 to 3 and dose 4 respectively. Are we assuming that those are the number of kids vaccinated? Now, the answer to that is that when you go in here to look at the activity list, each time you do an activity, you're required to say what the output is of that activity. First, you say an output measure, and then you say the output per single activity. So when you administer an RTSS 1, 2, or 3 vaccine during a routine activity, that could be like in a clinic, for example, you usually are doing it one at a time. And so what you would do then, you just say that that's one. But then when you administer a RTSS 1, 2, or 3 or RTSS 4 vaccine in an outreach session, then you're usually doing a group of people or a group of vaccines administered rather than just one vaccine. The reason that we do a group there is because there's going to be costs for transport that you're going to have to divide among those 60 or 50 or 100 people who you vaccinate in a group. So in this case, what you would go do is you'd say, in this case, we said, well, on average, let's say that when you do an outreach session, that you vaccinate 60 people in that outreach session, a single outreach session. And you can say the same for RTSS4 as well if you want to, or you can say I put 50 here. It doesn't matter what you put here comparing one with the other. You have to decide how many vaccines you think you're going to administer during a outreach session. So if you think you're going to do 200, you can put 200 there. If you think it's going to be 1,000, you can put 1,000 there. Right now, I'm putting 60 and 50 as an example. Now let's take a look at how that affects the final outcome of the costs. When you then go to the activities costing here in service delivery, you'll see that when you are administering a regular vaccination here, like 1, 2, or 3, you'll say, okay, you'll see here that we're saying that we're doing 95% of our vaccines here in each sub-county as a regular vaccination. And I'm looking right here for RTSS 1, 2, or 3. And then you say, okay, I'm doing one vaccine. I'm administering one vaccine for that regular service delivery activity. Now, it says here that it's going to cost me 10,000 shillings in financial costs to do that. Now let's take a look and see why that is. So I'm going to go to the detailed service delivery costs here. I see it's taking me 5 minutes to administer the vaccine. Now I'm seeing outreach sessions here for administering a routine activity. So you have outreach sessions, lunch allowances here, but you really don't need that because this is just a routine activity. It's not an outreach session. So we can now get rid of this here. And you can put this back down to 0. There you go. Now you see that since it's a routine, regular activity, not an outreach or group activity, you see that really the cost now goes down to 39 shillings, or about 39 cents here. Right? So that's going to be much more reasonable. So now when I go back to the annual assumptions, you're going to see that we're down to 39. It's not 10,000 here as it was before. Okay? And you'll see routine activity doesn't incur additional costs other than the personnel cost. And we'll see that 95% of 1, 2, and 3 are done like that. Here you have a situation where you're administering a group of RTSS 1, 2, or 3 vaccines during a routine outreach session. Okay? And the assumption that's being made here is 4,000 shillings, either financial or economic, for administering 60 vaccinations. Now let's go to the detailed service costs and see how that we've figured that one out. All right. And so question is, where do we include the travel time of the nurse? Ron, you check. See, what's happening here is that you really are going to have a whole day probably of their time. Okay? So in this case, you're saying that it's going to be, if it's going to be a whole day here, then how many minutes would that be? Well, that would be, let's say it's 10 hours, okay? So it'd be 10 times 60 minutes, right? So that would be, equals 10 times 60 minutes here, and that would be 600 hours. 600 minutes, of course, right? So that's delivering the vaccine there. And then you have the same thing for delivering the vaccine here if you have 2 nurses. Okay, there you have that. So the next question is, how do we deal with the allowances? So the question comes in here, the transport reimbursement for the health facility outreach activity here. So apparently what's happened is we've said that it's going to be 2,000, right? And we're saying that we want to account for travel that is shared among different activities. So let's say that half of this is going to be allocated to another activity, and half of this is going to be allocated to RTSS. In that case, what you would say is you'd say it was equal to times 0.5, right? Which is going to then allocate it here. And then you can make a note here, say 50% allocated to RTSS outreach activity. And then you have a note for yourself here, right here. Okay? So in that case, now you have the allowances and the personnel. And now as you go back to here, you'll see that when you go back to the assumptions here, that the assumed costs here are 2,000 and then the 11,000, right? Okay. So we keep it at that. And that's 5% of the activities. Now for those 10 hours you're saying, and 10 hours and 2 people, we're getting 60 vaccinations administered. If you think that those 2 people over the course of a day are going to be able to vaccinate more than 60 people, then you would need to go back into this area, as we showed before, which was the activity list, and you would want to say, okay, well, maybe we can vaccinate 100 people with 2 people doing it and having 10 hours. So that's their time, including their travel time. So there I put that to 100. there, and you'll see that when you go back to the service delivery here, then it says 100. And now what's going to happen here after you've done this is that when you go to the outputs, that you're going to have a much different cost. So I'm going to now go to the outputs here, and you'll see this here now is the cost. Okay. Right. Okay. And ultimately, that is going to have a great effect on the cost, as you'll see. As we go to the dashboard now, you'll see that when you do RTSS 1, 2, and 3, then you'll see that the cost is going down at this point, right? And it will go down even further as we change the amounts that are being spent for the RTSS 4 group vaccinations. So here I am at the administer a group of RTSS 4 vaccines during a routine outreach session, and we'd said before that there's 50 vaccinations administered. So here I am, I'm just going to go here and say a diploma holder and a certificate holder again. All right, and we say that they're going to be out for 10 hours, which is 600 minutes. Okay, so that's the amount per day. Right, and you see the allowances are going to be, let's see, a health facility outreach per diem, for example, and let's say here we go, outreach session nurse, outreach session transport allowance nurse, right? And we said that 50% shared with other activities, 50% shared with other activities. So here you had equals 2 people times 0.5, so it was two lunch allowances, right? And then you're multiplying it by 0.5, which means that that's half of it, so you come out with 1. Here it equals 2 times 0.5, right? I'm not sure if you're going to have a health facility outreach per diem or not. If you are, then you can put that in the same way, right? And so here you have, you're doing 1 day, 2 people, and you're doing 50 outputs per single activity. And then what you'll see when you go back here to the assumptions of the RTSS 4 vaccines, that you have these assumptions here of what it's going to cost to do vaccination of 50 people, right? And so you know that that's going to be 5% of it. And so that's that being done now, you're going to see now you have a cost of $94.99.